In the dusty attic of an abandoned homestead, a weathered cowboy discovers something that will shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. A leather-bound journal, yellowed with age, containing his mother's most intimate thoughts and a secret that could change his destiny forever. What happens when the truth about your past rewrites your entire future? This is the story of Jake Morrison, a man who thought he knew who he was, until his mother's words from beyond the grave revealed a truth more powerful than any legend of the Wild West. Jake Morrison had spent 35 years believing he was nothing more than a drifter's son, born to a woman who died when he was barely old enough to remember her face. The wind-carved lines on his weathered face told stories of countless sunrises on horseback, of cattle drives across endless plains, and of a life lived without roots or purpose beyond the next paycheck. He worked various ranches across Texas and New Mexico, never staying long enough to form lasting bonds, carrying only what fit in his saddlebags and the weight of questions he'd never found answers to. On a particularly scorching afternoon in July, Jake found himself at the old Whitmore Ranch, 30 miles outside of Fay. The property had been abandoned for over a decade, its fences sagging and buildings slowly surrendering to the desert wind. He'd been hired by the bank to assess what could be salvaged before they put the land up for auction. As he walked through the main house, his boots echoing hollow against the wooden floors, something drew him toward the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The attic was a tomb of forgotten memories, filled with dust-covered furniture and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through a small window, illuminating particles that danced in the stale air like spirits of the past. Jake methodically began cataloging items, but his attention was caught by an old cedar chest tucked beneath the eaves. Unlike everything else, this chest seemed to call out to him with an inexplicable familiarity. Inside the chest, beneath layers of moth-eaten quilts and faded photographs, his fingers found something that made his heart stop. A leather journal, bound with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to gray with age. The moment his hands touched the worn cover, Jake felt an electric connection, as if the book itself recognized him. When he opened to the first page, the elegant handwriting seemed to leap off the yellowed paper, and the words at the top made his breath catch in his throat. For my beloved son, Jake, should he ever find his way back to the truth. The signature at the bottom of the page was written in the same flowing script, with all my love. Your mother, Eleanor Whitmore Morrison. Jake's hands trembled as he realized he wasn't just cataloging a stranger as abandoned belongings. He was standing in what had once been his childhood home, holding his mother's most private thoughts in his hands. Jake's legs gave way beneath him as the magnitude of his discovery sank in. He sank to his knees on the dusty attic floor, the journal clutched against his chest like a lifeline to a past he'd never known existed. All these years, he'd been told his mother was a nameless woman who died in childbirth, and his father was a drifter who disappeared before Jake was born. The man who raised him, old Pete Morrison, had taken him in as a baby and given him a surname, but had always claimed to know nothing about Jake's real parents. With trembling fingers, Jake began to read his mother's words, written in the weeks before his birth. Eleanor wrote of her deep love for a man named Thomas Whitmore, Jake's true father, who had owned this very ranch. She described their secret marriage, performed by a traveling preacher under a canopy of desert stars, and her joy at discovering she was carrying their child. But as Jake read on, the entries took a darker turn. Thomas had powerful enemies, men who wanted his land and would stop at nothing to get it, including threatening the life of his pregnant wife. The journal revealed that Eleanor had been forced to flee in the night, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known to protect her unborn child. She wrote of the heartbreak of abandoning her husband, not knowing if she would ever see him again. The entries described her difficult journey to a distant town where she gave birth to Jake in secrecy, her health failing as she struggled to survive alone. Her final entries were written from her deathbed, as she arranged for her infant son to be placed with old Pete, a trusted friend who promised to keep Jake safe by hiding his true identity. But it was the revelation in the journal's final pages that struck Jake like lightning. Eleanor wrote of a hidden treasure, not gold or silver, but something far more valuable. Before fleeing the ranch, Thomas had hidden detailed maps and legal documents proving ownership of vast oil deposits beneath Whitmore land. These papers, if found, would make their son one of the richest men in the territory. Eleanor had hidden clues to their location throughout the journal, written in a code only she and Thomas knew, believing that one day their son would return home and claim his rightful inheritance. Jake realized that the men who had driven his parents apart might still be alive, still controlling the land that rightfully belonged to him. The Whitmore Ranch hadn't been abandoned by choice. It had been stolen through intimidation and false claims. As he sat in the dusty attic where his mother had once lived and loved, Jake felt something awakening within him that he'd never experienced before, a sense of purpose, of belonging, and of justice that demanded to be served. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the attic floor as Jake continued reading his mother's journal with growing intensity. It was then that he discovered an entry that changed everything he thought he knew about old Pete Morrison, the man who had raised him. In Eleanor's careful handwriting, Jake found the truth about his guardian. Pete hadn't been just a kind stranger who took in an orphan baby. He had been Thomas Whitmore's best friend and business partner, and he had made a sacred promise to protect Jake at all costs. The journal revealed that Pete had known exactly who Jake was all these years, but had kept the secret to protect him from the dangerous men who had destroyed his family. Eleanor wrote about how Pete had agreed to take Jake far away and raise him as his own son, never revealing his true heritage until it was safe to do so. But what shook Jake to his core was learning that Pete had been waiting for a sign that the time was right to reveal the truth. And that sign was Jake finding his way back to the Whitmore Ranch on his own. As Jake processed this revelation, he heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching the house below. His instincts, honed by years of survival on the frontier, immediately put him on alert. Through the small attic window, he could see 3 riders dismounting near the front porch, their faces hard and their intentions clearly not friendly. The leader, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, was someone Jake recognized from wanted posters in various towns: Silas Brennan, a ruthless land grabber known for using violence to get what he wanted. Jake realized that his presence at the ranch hadn't gone unnoticed. Somehow, Brennan and his men had learned that someone was investigating the old Whitmore property, and they had come to ensure that whatever secrets the ranch held would remain buried forever. As Jake listened to the men's voices growing closer, he understood that this wasn't a coincidence. These were likely the same men, or their descendants, who had driven his parents apart 35 years ago, and they were still protecting their ill-gotten gains. With his mother's journal pressed against his chest, Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could run, as his mother had been forced to do, and spend the rest of his days wondering what might have been. Or he could stay and fight for the truth, for justice, and for the legacy that was rightfully his. The scared little boy, who had grown up not knowing where he belonged, was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood his purpose. But as the floorboards creaked below him with the weight of approaching boots, Jake realized that claiming his heritage might cost him his life. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as Brennan's men kicked in the front door, their heavy footsteps now thundering through the rooms below. Jake carefully closed the journal and tucked it inside his vest, knowing that it contained not just his family's history, but also the evidence that could bring down the men who had stolen his birthright. The showdown that had been 35 years in the making was about to begin. Jake's heart pounded as he listened to the men systematically searching the house below, their voices carrying clearly through the thin ceiling. Brennan was giving orders with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. telling his men to look for anything that might connect the Whitmore family to the land. Jake realized they weren't just trying to scare away a trespasser. They were desperately searching for the same evidence that his mother had hidden decades ago. From his hiding place in the attic, Jake overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Brennan was talking to someone via radio, reporting that they had received word that Thomas Whitmore's son might still be alive and looking for his inheritance. The voice on the other end belonged to someone Brennan addressed as Mr. Garrison, and Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized the name. Garrison Industries had been buying up land throughout the territory for years, always seeming to know exactly which properties would become valuable for oil drilling. The pieces of a massive conspiracy began falling into place in Jake's mind. His father's enemies hadn't been just local thugs trying to steal ranch land. They had been part of a sophisticated operation to acquire oil-rich properties through intimidation and fraud. The Whitmore Ranch had been one of their first major victories, and they had built an empire on the foundation of his family's stolen legacy. Brennan and his current crew weren't just protecting old secrets. They were safeguarding millions of dollars in ongoing illegal operations. As Jake listened to the men searching below, he began to understand the code his mother had written about in her journal. The seemingly random numbers and letters scattered throughout her entries weren't just sentimental notations. They were coordinates and references to specific locations on the ranch where his father had hidden the proof of their oil claims. Eleanor had been brilliant, encoding the information in what appeared to be the emotional ramblings of a heartbroken woman, when in reality she was preserving the key to a fortune that could expose decades of corruption. The sound of boots on the attic stairs jolted Jake back to immediate danger. One of Brennan's men was coming up to search the last room in the house, and Jake had nowhere to run. He pressed himself against the far wall behind the cedar chest, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. But as the footsteps grew closer, Jake realized that a gunfight in the confined space of the attic would be suicide against 3 armed men. Instead, Jake made a desperate decision. Using skills learned from years of working around skittish horses and dangerous cattle, he moved with silent precision toward the small attic window. The drop to the ground below was significant, but the alternative was certain death. As the attic door creaked open behind him, Jake pushed through the window frame and dropped into the desert twilight, his mother's journal still pressed safely against his heart. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, but managed to reach his horse tied behind the house just as shouts erupted from the attic above. Jake rode hard into the desert night, his horse's hooves pounding against the rocky terrain as gunshots echoed behind him. Brennan and his men had discovered his escape and were in pursuit, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. But Jake had an advantage they didn't expect. He knew this land in ways that went deeper than memory, as if his blood itself carried the knowledge of every canyon and mesa for miles around. As dawn broke over the horizon, Jake found himself at the first location referenced in his mother's coded entries, a distinctive rock formation that resembled a sleeping giant, exactly as Eleanor had described it. Hidden in a crevice that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, Jake discovered a waterproof metal box that had been waiting for him for over 3 decades. Inside were original surveying documents signed by his father, proving not only ownership of the Whitmore Ranch, but also legal claims to oil drilling rights across thousands of acres, now controlled by Garrison Industries. The documents revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against his family. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just been a rancher. He had been a geological engineer who had identified some of the richest oil deposits in the territory. His surveys and legal claims, all properly filed and witnessed, proved that Garrison Industries had built their empire on fraudulent titles and forged documents. But Jake also found something that chilled him to the bone. A letter from Thomas to Eleanor, written just days before she fled, warning that he had learned of a plan to kill them both and make it look like an accident. Jake now understood why his mother had been forced to run and why she had died in poverty while the men who killed his father lived in luxury built on stolen wealth. But he also realized that finding the truth was only the beginning of his battle. Garrison Industries now employed hundreds of people and had political connections that reached the highest levels of state government. A lone cowboy with a handful of old documents would be easily dismissed or, more likely, permanently silenced before he could present his case. As Jake studied the papers his father had hidden, he discovered references to additional evidence caches scattered across the ranch property. His parents had been thorough, understanding that their enemies would stop at nothing to steal their legacy. But they had also been clever, creating a trail of evidence that would be impossible to destroy completely if someone was determined enough to follow it to the end. The sound of approaching horses reminded Jake that he was still being hunted. But as he carefully returned the documents to their hiding place and prepared to seek the next cache, he felt a presence he couldn't explain, as if his parents were somehow guiding him, giving him the strength and wisdom he needed to finish what they had started. The frightened young man who had discovered the journal just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood his true calling. Jake Morrison, son of Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, was going home to claim what was rightfully his, and no amount of bullets or threats would stop him from honoring his parents' sacrifice. 3 months later, Jake stood on the front porch of the restored Whitmore Ranch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The legal battles had been fierce and dangerous, but the evidence he had methodically gathered from his parents' hidden caches had been overwhelming. Garrison Industries was facing criminal charges for fraud, theft, and conspiracy, while Silas Brennan and his crew were awaiting trial for attempted murder and decades of violent intimidation. The transformation had been remarkable not just in legal terms, but in Jake himself. The rootless drifter who had wandered from job to job, never belonging anywhere, had discovered not just his heritage but his purpose. With the oil revenues that were rightfully his, Jake had established the Whitmore Foundation, dedicated to helping other families who had lost their land to corporate greed and legal manipulation. Old Pete Morrison, finally free to tell the truth after decades of protective silence, had become Jake's closest advisor and the grandfather figure Jake had never known he needed. Jake had also found something he never expected to discover: love. Sarah Martinez, the lawyer who had helped him navigate the complex legal challenges, had seen past his rough exterior to the man of integrity beneath. She understood his need for justice and shared his vision of using their victory to help others who faced similar struggles. Their wedding had been held on the ranch, under the same desert stars where his parents had spoken their vows so many years ago. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the connection Jake now felt to the land itself. Every morning, he walked the boundaries his father had surveyed, touched the earth that held his family's dreams, and felt the presence of the parents he had never known, but who had never stopped protecting him. His mother's journal had become his most treasured possession, not for the fortune it had led him to, but for the love that filled every page. Standing in the doorway of the house where he had been born, Jake reflected on the strange journey that had brought him home. A simple job cataloging abandoned property had become a quest for identity, justice, and ultimately, the discovery of who he was meant to be. The words his mother had written in hope and desperation had indeed rewritten his destiny, transforming him from a man without roots into the guardian of a legacy that would benefit generations to come. As Sarah joined him on the porch, her hand finding his, Jake opened his mother's journal to the final page, where Eleanor had written her last words to the son she would never see grow up. "Remember, my darling boy, that home isn't just a place. It has the love that calls you back to where you belong." Looking out over the land that had finally welcomed him home, Jake Morrison smiled, knowing that he had found not just his past, but his future in the pages of his mother's enduring love.